There is a reason the military seals a file before sending someone in, not to protect the mission, to protect the person from what they are walking into. The morning Lieutenant Mara Weston stepped through the gates of Fort Bragg. Her file had been sealed for 11 days. Her name tag had been removed. Her service record, her commendations, her 8 years with SEAL Team 6, all of it locked behind a clearance code that only 2 people in the building knew existed. To every officer on that base, she was simply a transfer, a name on a list, one more body moving through the system. That was exactly the point. She had volunteered for this, not because she needed the work, not because Rear Admiral Diane Merritt had asked her twice. She volunteered because she had spent the better part of a decade operating in places where the enemy was visible, where the threat came from outside the wire, where you knew when someone raised a weapon against you that they had always been the enemy. Fort Bragg was different. Here the threat wore the same uniform. 3 weeks earlier, Merritt had called Mara into her office at Naval Station Norfolk and closed the door without a word. That was the first signal. Merritt was not a woman who closed doors for routine briefings. She was the kind of officer who conducted difficult conversations in open spaces, a habit built over 30 years of watching men in closed rooms make decisions that destroyed other people's careers. The second signal was the folder on her desk. Plain manila. No cover sheet, no classification stamp on the outside. Merritt sat down, folded her hands, and looked at Mara the way she always did when she was about to ask something she had no right to ask. "I need someone who won't flinch," she said. Mara didn't respond. She had learned years ago that Merritt's opening lines were never the actual question. "Colonel Raymond Pruitt." Merritt pushed the folder across the desk without opening it. "Commanding officer at Advanced Tactical Leadership Program, Fort Bragg, 18 months in that role. Before that, 22 years of what looks on paper like a solid career." "Looks like," Mara said. "Looks like." Merritt nodded. "I've had 3 complaints in the last 8 months, 2 withdrawn before formal filing, 1 submitted and subsequently reassigned out of my office to a review board that has done absolutely nothing with it." She paused. "I have a strong suspicion that the officers who withdrew their complaints did so because withdrawing felt safer than the alternative." Mara opened the folder. The 3 complaints were brief. Clinical language, the kind officers use when they are trying to be precise and professional and not sound like what they actually are, which is afraid. Hostile conduct toward incoming personnel. Unauthorized modification of assessment criteria. Conduct unbecoming. The third one, the one that had actually been filed, included a line that Mara read twice. Systematic targeting of officers perceived as outsiders to established unit culture. She closed the folder. "You want a leadership integrity assessment?" Mara said. "I want someone who will walk in there, let him show me exactly who he is and not break character before he does." Merritt looked at her steadily. "And I want someone who can handle whatever comes after." Mara set the folder back on the desk. Outside the window, the Chesapeake was flat and gray in the November light. "When do I leave?" she asked. She drove herself to Fort Bragg. That was the first thing people noticed later when they reconstructed the morning. Not a staff car, not a driver. She came in a government-issued sedan, parked it herself in the visitor lot, and walked toward the administrative complex, carrying nothing but a single bag and the expression of someone who had already decided how the day would end. The morning was cold, the kind that settles into old injuries and does not apologize. Mara felt it in her left shoulder where a piece of shrapnel had been removed in a forward surgical unit outside Kandahar in 2011. The scar tissue tightened in the cold. It always did. She didn't adjust her pace. She wore her uniform without a name tag. The insignia was correct. The rank was displayed. But the space where a name should have been was bare, and she had noted in 11 years of service that nothing unsettled certain kinds of officers quite like a blank space where identifying information should exist. It suggested that the person wearing it had been authorized to move without a name. And that was a level of clearance most people in that building would never hold. Before she reached the door, she checked her left wrist. The watch was there. It always was. A G-Shock. Black casing military spec, the kind issued to special operations units in the early 2000s. The crystal face was cracked along the upper left quadrant, a diagonal split that had been there for 12 years. She had never replaced it. The watch had belonged to Corporal Dennis Farrow. He had been her spotter for 2 deployments, a quiet man from rural Montana who narrated his own movements under his breath during operations, not anxiously, but the way a craftsman describes what he is doing because precision required language. He died on a hillside outside Kunar province in 2012, covering her withdrawal when a secondary explosive detonated. The crack in the watch face happened at the same moment. She had been wearing it ever since. She didn't intend to explain this to anyone at Fort Bragg. She walked through the door. The briefing hall was in the administrative wing of the ATLP compound, a long rectangular room with fluorescent lighting and rows of metal folding chairs arranged with military precision. There were 14 officers already present when Mara entered. She took a seat near the back and watched. Watching was something she was exceptionally good at. The front of the room held 3 men arranged in the informal hierarchy that forms naturally among men who have known each other long enough. The one in the center was Colonel Raymond Pruitt. He was 57 years old and carried himself the way men do when they have been the largest presence in a room for so long that they have stopped noticing the room itself. Broad shoulders, slightly thicker now than in the photographs in his service file, gray at the temples, close cropped. His uniform was immaculate, every decoration correctly placed, every crease sharp. He was a man who understood that appearance was a language and that speaking it fluently was a form of power. He was also working very hard at looking like he wasn't watching the door. To his left stood Lieutenant Garrett Slade. 29 years old, built like someone who had decided at 17 that the body was an argument he intended to win. He had the physical confidence that gets mistaken for competence, and from the way he positioned himself behind and to the left of Pruitt, it was clear he had decided long ago where his loyalty lived and what that loyalty was worth. He was scanning the room with narrow eyes, cataloging, sorting. He was not reading the room correctly. To Pruitt's right stood Sergeant Owen Cassidy. 41 years old, compact, and still with the look of a man who had seen enough to stop being surprised and not quite enough to stop caring. Before the briefing had begun, she had heard him laugh at something Slade said near the door, a quick surface sound the kind men produce in proximity to authority, when they have learned that producing it costs less than not producing it. But the laugh had not reached his eyes. She had noticed that. She always noticed that. Now he stood with both hands at his sides, watching the floor. And then briefly, without apparent reason, he looked up and his eyes found Mara across the room, with a directness that lasted exactly 1 second before he looked away. She filed that away. Cassidy was not what he appeared to be. Colonel Pruitt began the briefing at 0800 with the practiced ease of a man who had given this speech many times. He outlined the structure of the ATLP program, the assessment criteria, the standards expected of officers who intended to lead advanced tactical units. He spoke with authority in a slight undertone that suggested the standards he was describing were, in his estimation, somewhat above what most of the people in this room could meet. Mara listened and said nothing. At 0823, Pruitt paused mid-sentence and looked at her. A deliberate pause. Not the hesitation of a man who had lost his train of thought, but the stop of a man who had decided that a particular moment had arrived. You. He didn't gesture. He simply looked. You're the transfer applicant. The room shifted. Not dramatically. A small reconfiguration of attention. Mara stood. Yes, sir. Pruitt studied her with the careful blankness of a man pretending not to have already formed an opinion. His eyes moved from her face to her rank insignia to the empty space where her name tag was not. The empty space seemed to bother him in a way that the rank did not. You don't have a name tag, he said. No, sir. Why is that standard procedure for provisional assessment entry, sir, per the directive issued by the review authority? Something moved behind his eyes. He didn't like that answer. Not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly right, and being exactly right in a way he couldn't contest required him to find a different approach. He stepped down from the front of the room and walked toward her. The 14 other officers watched with the stillness of people who have sensed that something is happening and have correctly decided that the wisest response is to remain very quiet. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at her the way certain men look at things they have decided they don't need to take seriously. You don't look like much, he said. Not loudly, almost conversationally. Behind him, Slade made a sound. It had the structure of a laugh. Mara's expression did not change. Sir, she said, I'm here to complete the assessment. The assessment? Pruitt repeated the words as if they were slightly foreign to him. And what makes you think you belong in an assessment for elite tactical leadership? What makes you think you are ready to lead the kind of units this program trains? My service record, sir. I don't have your service record. Your file came in sealed. He let that sit for a moment. That tells me one of two things. Either someone up the chain pulled strings for you, or someone up the chain is trying to prove a point about diversity numbers. He tilted his head slightly. Which is it? The room was very quiet. Mara had been in situations where the correct tactical response was to wait, where action before the right moment cost more than patience. She had learned that lesson in places where the cost was measured in ways that made this hallway feel almost abstract by comparison. She waited. Pruitt moved closer. "Before we begin," he said, "we need to establish something. We need to know if you can follow orders." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said calmly and clearly, "Take off your jacket." The fluorescent lights hummed. "Is that part of the assessment, sir?" Mara asked. "It is now." She looked at him, not with defiance, not with anger, with the quiet focus of someone who has finished a calculation and is deciding when to show their work. "Take off your uniform," Pruitt said again louder. "You don't deserve to wear it until you prove you're worth it." Slade smirked. Two officers near the back of the room exchanged a glance. Cassidy looked at the floor, and then Mara smiled. Not widely, not warmly, a small, precise curve of the lips that changed the temperature of the room in a way no one could have explained, but every one of them felt. "Sir," she said quietly, "you just told a Navy SEAL to strip." The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was a presence. It occupied the room the way smoke occupies a space, filling corners, changing the quality of the air. Pruitt blinked. Mara removed her jacket. She did it slowly, not theatrically, with the deliberate calm of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to demonstrate. She turned her left arm toward the room, and on the inside of her forearm, tattooed in clean, precise lines that had faded slightly with age, was the trident, the emblem of the United States Navy SEALs. Eagle Anchor Pistol Trident. She had received it after Hell Week in 2006, sitting in a folding chair in a room that smelled like salt water and antiseptic, with the exhaustion that goes below bone, all the way to whatever it is that remains when everything else has been stripped away. Slade's smirk was gone. Two officers at the back of the room sat forward. Cassidy raised his eyes and looked at her face with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition, as if something he had been waiting to see had finally arrived. 8 years, Mara said. Team 6, 4 combat deployments, 2 theaters, operations I will not name because you don't have the clearance to hear them. She looked directly at Pruitt. "So if you want to know whether I can follow orders, Colonel, I have followed orders at 3 in the morning in conditions that would end your career just to hear about. I have followed orders with rounds in the air and teammates down and no extraction window open." She paused. "What I am standing here wondering is whether you understood what kind of order you just gave." The ventilation system clicked off. Pruitt's face was doing several things at once. The color had shifted. The certainty was fractured. But underneath the fracture, something else was visible, something that changed her read of the situation completely. He was not broken. He was recalibrating. Men who are simply arrogant collapse when confronted. She had seen it before. The bluster drops, the apology surfaces, and the situation resolves through the simple act of being seen clearly. Pruitt did not collapse. He stood very still for a moment, and then his expression settled into something that was almost not quite, but almost a smile. "All right then," he said quietly. His eyes were sharper now, not softer. "Prove it." Mara held his gaze. She had expected retreat, embarrassment, the pro forma apology that would trigger the next phase of the assessment. She had not expected this. And the part of her that had spent 8 years reading threat environments registered with quiet precision that the man across from her had not been surprised. He had been waiting. She put her jacket back on with the same deliberate calm with which she had removed it. "Gladly," she said. Outside, the November cold had deepened. The training grounds behind the administrative compound were a flat gray expanse of packed earth and purpose-built obstacles, infrastructure, designed to separate the people who believe they can do something from the people who actually can. Mara had trained on courses more demanding than this. Her body carried the memory of thousands of hours of repetition compressed into something that no longer required thought. She had 1 minute before the first assessment began. She used it to look at Pruitt. He stood at the edge of the training ground, arms at his sides, watching her with the same unsettled steadiness she had seen in the briefing hall. Beside him, Slade was saying something low, probably something unpleasant. Pruitt was not responding. He was watching Mara the way a man watches something he is trying to categorize and finding that none of his categories quite fit. That was what made him different from the men she had expected to find. He was paying attention. That made him more dangerous, not less. The whistle blew. She launched forward. She cleared the first wall in 11 seconds. Not to impress anyone, because 11 seconds was the correct speed given the grip conditions and her approach angle. The landing roll was textbook. Her boots found the dirt, and she was already moving, already tracking the next obstacle, her breathing controlled and deliberate. From the sidelines, she heard Slade's voice. She's showing off. She heard Pruitt say nothing. The rope climb was a transition. She swung across and took the height without hesitation, and at the top, for exactly 2 seconds, she scanned the course the way she would scan any unknown terrain. That was when she saw Slade moving toward the mud pit. He was too casual. The angle was wrong. His hands were positioned slightly behind his thigh in a way that had no natural explanation unless there was something in them. She had the picture before she had the details. She approached at full speed and stopped dead 3 meters out. Slade stepped forward, something long and metal held low. Mara looked at him. "Move," she said. "Or what?" She covered the distance in one step. Her hand moved before Slade had processed that she had moved, and the metal bar was out of his grip and in her hand and in the air and gone, and she was through the mud pit and across the finish line before the sound of the bar hitting the ground had finished echoing. The instructor with the stopwatch stood very still. He looked at the number, then he looked at Mara. 2 minutes, 14 seconds. He said it with the care of a man ensuring there would be no room for argument. "That's a record." "I know," Mara said. Slade stood at the mud pit with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who has just understood for the first time the distance between what he believed about himself and what is actually true. Pruitt watched from 20 meters away. He had already turned toward the firearms range before the instructor finished speaking. He was thinking about the next test. Mara watched the back of his head. She recognized the specific shape of a threat that is repositioning rather than retreating. She followed him toward the range. The firearms range sat 200 meters east of the obstacle course, separated by a tree line of scrub pine. The smell hit first solvent and carbon, and the sharp residue that propellant leaves in cold air. It was the smell of work, of the specific state of attention that weapons training demanded, a narrowing of the world to a single point until there was only the target, the distance, the win, and the decision. The instructor handed her a standard issue M4. She checked it automatically, magazine, seated chamber, cleared safety position, confirmed, and brought it to her shoulder. The familiar weight settled, and for a moment the distance between this training range and every other place she had held a rifle collapsed entirely. There was only the work. The course of fire was standard combat qualification. Moving targets, 10 stations, the kind that infantry officers found challenging enough to take seriously. Mara had completed this qualification at night, in water, in conditions where both the targets and she were moving simultaneously. She shot. The first target came out at 30 meters. She acquired it in under a second and put 2 rounds center mass with the unhurried precision of someone whose mechanics no longer required conscious thought. The second came up at 45 meters faster angled. Same result. By the 5th target, the instructor had stopped marking his clipboard. By the 8th, Slade had stopped watching the targets. He was watching Mara. She felt the shift in his attention. It was not respect. Respect would have required him to revise a belief system he had built his self-image around, and that kind of revision does not happen on a firing range in a single morning. But something in the register between surprise and the early unwilling stages of recognition. She cleared the final station with a 3-round grouping that landed inside a pattern the size of a man's fist. The range went quiet. The instructor walked down to the target, looked at it, walked back. He set his clipboard face down on the equipment table. "Ma'am," he finally said with the slight awkwardness of a man using a form of address he had not expected to use today, "where did you qualify last?" "I'm not able to share that," Mara said. He nodded as if that answer explained everything. Because it did. Pruitt stepped forward. He had been watching her the way a man watches an outcome. He had not accounted for the accounting, still running behind his eyes. "Hand to hand," he said. The mat was inside the training facility, a converted warehouse structure with rubber flooring and ceiling-mounted lighting. There were 8 officers present, some who had been there all morning, and some who had been informed through the informal network that exists on every military installation that something worth watching was happening today. Pruitt gestured toward Slade. "You'll work with Lieutenant Slade. He's one of our best." Slade stepped onto the mat with the confidence of a man who had used his size his entire career to establish an outcome before technique even began. Mara stepped onto the mat. She tightened her ponytail. "Try not to break a nail," Slade said. She looked at him with an expression entirely empty of the reaction he was looking for, which was the most effective possible response, because it told him his opener had not landed and that the distance between what he expected and what was actually in front of him was larger than he had calculated. The instructor called the start. Slade came forward with the confidence of a man who had ended a lot of matches in the first 10 seconds. Direct, powerful. The kind of movement that worked against opponents who hesitated. Mara did not hesitate. She was already moving before he had closed half the distance, a lateral step that put her outside his line. Her hands finding his forearm with the mechanical certainty of a technique drilled past the point of thought. She used his momentum the way water uses gravity. He went down. The mat made a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Slade was up fast. He processed the first takedown as an anomaly rather than information and came again with more force. The additional force made the second technique simpler because it gave her more to work with. She ducked under his arm, spun, drove her knee into position, secured his arm, and applied pressure calibrated precisely to the line between compliance and injury. Tap, she said quietly. No. A fractional shift of weight, a millimeter of additional angle. The sound Slade made was not a word. His hands slapped the mat 3 times. She released him and stood. The room was silent in the way rooms get when something has happened that changes the nature of what everyone thought they were watching. Pruitt had not moved from the edge of the mat. He was looking at Mara with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger, not the repositioning calculation of the firing range. Something older and more complicated. It was the expression of a man who had begun to understand the actual size of his problem. She stepped off the mat. She didn't look back. Pruitt called a 15-minute break at 1100. Mara found a spot near the east wall of the training facility, away from the other officers, and stood with her coffee and watched the room sort itself. The group had divided as groups always divide when a power structure is disrupted, those aligning closer to Pruitt, speaking in lower voices, and those doing the quiet calculus of where it might now be safer to stand. It was Cassidy who crossed the room. He moved without hurry, the same compact stillness she had noted in the briefing hall. He stopped beside her and looked at the room rather than at her. They stood in silence for a moment. That watch, he said finally, his voice low and even. He didn't look at her wrist. He had already looked earlier with the brief and total attention of someone who recognized what they were seeing. Field issue, 2009 pattern, the G-Shock they put out to SOCOM before they switched suppliers. Mara said nothing. You were in Kandahar, he said, not a question. She turned her head slightly and looked at him. He was still watching the room. His jaw was set in the way of a man keeping the surface of his face from showing what was happening underneath. The watch was my spotter's, she said. Cassidy was quiet for a moment. He didn't come back, he said. No. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub pine. Through the high windows, the sky had gone the flat white of late morning overcast. I've been watching Colonel Pruitt run this program for 3 years, Cassidy said. The practiced evenness of a man who has rehearsed the act of saying something difficult and found that rehearsal helps with the delivery but does nothing about the weight. In 3 years, I have watched 11 officers come through this program and leave in a condition that had nothing to do with their performance. Mara waited, dismissed for cause that didn't hold up, transferred to postings that ended careers, assessment failures with documentation that didn't match what I saw happen on the mat or on the range. He paused. Officers who weren't part of the culture Pruitt had built here. Officers who didn't have the right background, the right connections, the right version of what this program was supposed to look like. Keep going, Mara said. He looked at her for the first time since crossing the room. His eyes held a steadiness that comes not from certainty, but from the decision to be honest at a cost. I submitted my first transfer request 14 months after Pruitt arrived, Cassidy said. I watched the first 2 dismissals and I knew what I was seeing, and I put in the paperwork and it came back denied. Pruitt had signed the denial himself. He looked back at the room. I put in 6 more requests over the next 2 years, all denied, all signed by him. A pause. I have all 7 forms, and I have his handwriting on every single one. The weight of that sentence moved through the space between them. 7 requests, 3 years. Everyone stopped by the same hand. Mara looked at Cassidy. He was looking at the floor. Not in shame. In the way a man looks when he is measuring the distance between what he did and what he could have done, and already knows the answer. Why are you telling me now? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because you walked in this morning without a name tag, he said, and you're still here. The 4th test was not on the schedule. Pruitt announced it at 11:30 with the offhand manner of someone adding an agreed-upon item to a list. A tactical judgment assessment, a simulated decision scenario. Standard protocol, he said, for the advanced tier of ATLP qualification. This was a lie. Mara knew it because she had read the ATLP protocol document twice before leaving Norfolk, and no tactical judgment component appeared in the formal assessment structure. She knew it from Pruitt's voice, which had the specific flatness of a man delivering a prepared statement as if he hadn't prepared it. And she knew it from Cassidy's face when Pruitt made the announcement, a look of such complete absence of surprise that it could only mean he had seen this particular improvisation before. The scenario was read by an instructor she hadn't seen before. A heavy-set man in his 40s reading from a printed sheet. The scenario, a four-man team in a contested environment. One team member down with a non-survivable injury. Extraction window closing. Mission objective accessible but requiring the team leader to abandon the downed member to reach it. What was the call? Mara understood immediately what this was. Not a tactical scenario, a mirror. Pruitt was holding it up and waiting to see if she would make the call that protected the mission at the cost of the person, the kind of call that certain cultures celebrate as hardness and that other cultures recognize as something else entirely. He wanted to see if she was the kind of officer who could be shown a version of herself she did not like and then offered a structure that made it acceptable. She thought about Dennis Farrow for exactly the length of time it takes to breathe in and breathe out. Then she raised her hand. No scenario with a downed team member has a correct answer I'm willing to give in this room, Mara said. The variables are contextual specific and not reducible to a training assessment. Any officer who gives you a clean answer to that question in a briefing room has never had to make it in the field. She paused. The teams I've operated with have never left anyone behind when a viable alternative existed, and finding that alternative was always the first obligation before the mission objective. Silence. That's not the protocol, Slade said. Mara looked at him. Which protocol? Slade glanced at Pruitt. Pruitt said nothing. That nothing was its own answer. The break before the afternoon assessment was 30 minutes. Mara was in the corridor when Pruitt found her. He approached from behind. Without trying to be quiet, he wanted her to hear him coming. A man who had decided that the time for subtlety was over. Walk with me, he said. He led her to a small office at the end of the corridor. He closed the door and stood on the far side of the single desk without sitting. Standing suggested terms rather than negotiation. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. You're good, he said finally. That's not flattery. You're one of the better candidates I've seen come through this program. Mara said nothing. The morning had some friction, Pruitt continued. That happens. New personnel establish culture adjustment takes time. What I want you to understand is that the program works. The officers who commit to it, who demonstrate they can work within the culture here, those are the officers who leave with the recommendations that move careers. He let that sit. Mara was looking at a point slightly above his left shoulder. She had learned at considerable personal cost that maintaining eye contact with a man who is trying to manipulate you can be misread as agreement. What I'm offering, Pruitt said, his voice dropping slightly as the real point arrived, is an accommodation. You write a favorable assessment. I write you a recommendation. You're a SEAL with 8 years. There are command positions in this building and outside it that would benefit from your background. I know the people who fill those slots. He paused. That's not a small thing. The fluorescent light hummed. Outside a door opened and closed. Mara looked at Pruitt for a long moment. He held her gaze with the composure of a man who had made this offer before and watched it work, who had sat in rooms like this and watched officers do the calculation and arrive at the answer he needed. Not because they were weak, because the offer was structured to make weakness look like intelligence. She thought about Cassidy. 7 requests, 3 years. Everyone stopped by the same hand. She thought about 11 names she hadn't yet read on a list she was going to compile before the day was over. She thought about Dennis Farrow, who had trusted the people above him and who had never had anyone walk through a door to ask the question on his behalf. Is that everything, Colonel? She said. Pruitt held her gaze for one more second. Something shifted behind his eyes, not defeat, but the recognition that the offer had not landed and the situation was moving into territory he had not fully mapped. Dismissed, he said. Mara opened the door and walked out. She moved to the female officer's restroom, confirmed she was alone, and locked the single stall. She reached into the inside left pocket of her jacket and pressed 2 fingers against the small, rectangular device she had been required by the terms of her mission protocol call to activate at the beginning of each day. The device had been running since 0800. The conversation she had just had with Pruitt, every word of it was preserved in full and already encrypted for secure transmission. She stood in the locked stall longer than the task required, because what she had recorded was not only a man offering a bribe, it was the mechanism, the specific shape of how 11 people had ended up where they had ended up, how complaints had been withdrawn, how the pattern had maintained itself across 3 years without producing a consequence. not through violence, through the quiet, private, closed-door offer that translated when accepted into the belief that accommodation was reasonable rather than corruption. She unlocked the stall. She ran cold water over her wrists, a technique for resetting the nervous system when continued performance was required, and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. 34 years old, sharp jaw, gray eyes. The slight weathering that accumulates in people who spend years in wind and sustained attention. She had been in one form of fight or another for 12 years, and the face in the mirror showed it accurately, not dramatically, the way a landscape shows the weather it has received. She dried her hands and walked back toward the briefing room. The afternoon was waiting. So was Pruitt. She walked through the door. The afternoon session was a structural test leadership decision scenarios conducted in small groups, the kind of assessment that exists to observe how officers behave when they believe the evaluation is focused on someone else. Mara observed Pruitt throughout. He ran the scenarios with practiced competence, the residue of 22 years of genuine ability, showing through the accumulated damage of what 3 years of unchecked authority had done to him. She understood in a way she had not fully understood before, not a man who had always been this. He was a man who had become this slowly, and with rationalizations she could probably reconstruct if she tried, through the specific process by which people who are given power without adequate accountability eventually shape the power to fit what they want from it, rather than what it was given to them for. That understanding did not change anything about what she was there to do. It simply made it more precise. The scenarios ended at 14:30. Pruitt dismissed the group with the offhand authority of a man managing the routine of an ordinary day, which was itself a choice to treat the morning as already processed and filed to normalize what had happened through the performance of moving past it. The other officers filed out. Mara stayed. She found a chair near the window and sat with her folder and began writing field notes while the details were still exact. Time sequence behavior, exact words where she had them. This was the work that happened after the visible work, less dramatic but more consequential. The transformation of observed events into documented record that could survive challenge in a formal proceeding. She was 30 minutes into this when the door opened. Cassidy. He entered without ceremony and sat down 2 chairs from her, which was close enough for conversation and far enough from the door that anyone passing would not immediately see them together. "He's going to try something this afternoon," Cassidy said. Mara looked up from her notes. "He does this when the morning doesn't go the way he expected. He adds a component, something outside the formal structure." Cassidy set his hands on his knees and looked at them. "I've seen it 4 times in 3 years. The first time I thought it was initiative. The second time I thought it was a bad day. The third time I understood what it was." "What is it?" Mara asked. "It's a test for whether you'll accept the framework." He paused. "Not whether you're capable. Whether you'll accept that his version of capable is the version that matters." He looked at her. "The officers who've left this program badly, most of them made it through the formal assessments. They failed the informal ones, or didn't fail them depending on how you look at it." Mara considered this. "The 4th test this morning," she said. "The tactical judgment scenario." Cassidy nodded. "That's the one he uses for people he's decided might be a problem. People whose file doesn't give him what he needs." "My file was sealed." "Right." Cassidy looked at the window. "Your file was sealed so he couldn't build a case before you arrived. He had to construct one after." He paused. "The scenario is designed to get you on record as either willing to make a call he can characterize as heartless, which gives him a documentation angle, or as resistant to making hard calls, which gives him a different documentation angle. Either way, he ends up with material." Mara looked at him steadily. "You understand what you're telling me. I understand exactly what I'm telling you. And you understand what it means that you're telling me." He was quiet for a moment. When he looked at her, his eyes held the stone-colored steadiness she had first noticed in the briefing hall. The steadiness that comes not from certainty, but from having made a decision and committed to it past the point of revision. "I've been trying to reach someone for 14 months, he said. "I've put in 7 transfer requests and made 3 attempts to contact Inspector General through channels that kept getting redirected." He paused. "You walked in this morning without a name tag. You're still here. You're sitting in this room writing notes." He looked at the folder in her hands. "You're the person I've been trying to reach." The room was very quiet. Mara looked at the folder, then at Cassidy. "I need everything you have in writing," she said. "Dates, names, specific incidents, and I need the 7 transfer forms." "I have them." Where, on my person, he said simply. I've been carrying them for 8 months. She looked at him. 3 years of watching something wrong happen. 7 attempts to leave. 8 months carrying the documentation on his body because he no longer trusted any storage he didn't physically control. Tonight, she said, I'll tell you where. He nodded once, stood, and left the room without looking back. Pruitt announced the fourth component at 1500. He stood at the front of the reassembled group, 12 officers, now 2 having been released for other duties, and described it with the same offhand authority as every other announcement he had made that day. An extended tactical evaluation. Field conditions. A course he had designed himself to assess decision-making under physical and cognitive loads simultaneously. Not in the formal schedule, he acknowledged, but within his authority as program director, to add components he deemed necessary. He looked at Mara when he said the last part. She looked back at him with an expression that gave him nothing. The course was outside in the field training area east of the main compound, a square kilometer of mixed terrain that had been used for practical exercises since the 1980s, the kind of ground that looked simple from above and revealed its complexity at the level of boot soles. Mara had reviewed the base layout before arriving. She knew the terrain. The test structure was more sophisticated than anything in the morning. A timed navigation problem with decision nodes. At each node, a scenario card presented a situation requiring a command call. The cumulative choices would be scored at the end. What Pruitt did not announce, but what Mara understood from Cassidy's description, was that the scoring criteria were not the formal protocol criteria. They were Pruitt's criteria applied after the fact to whatever outcome he needed to produce. She ran the course. At each decision node, she made the call that was operationally sound and documented her reasoning on the reverse of each scenario card before submitting it, a step that was not required, but that created a paper record of the logic behind each choice, a record that would survive any post hoc recharacterization. Pruitt watched her submit the final card with an expression she was coming to recognize. The look of a man finding that a move he expected to land cleanly has landed on something solid and bounced. She had been doing this to him all day. He was going to stop letting her do it. The break before dinner was 45 minutes. She used 20 of them to call the NCIS duty agent assigned to her mission on the encrypted channel and transmit the recording from Pruitt's office along with her field notes from the day. She gave the agent a precise summary. The recording constituted documented evidence of an unauthorized inducement offered to an assessment operative during a formal integrity evaluation. The field notes documented a pattern of conduct that in her professional assessment constituted systematic abuse of supervisory authority. The agent said they would need until morning to process and confirm. She said morning was fine. She used the remaining 25 minutes to sit in her car in the parking lot of the visiting officer's quarters and think. The situation was more complex than the initial brief had suggested. She had walked in expecting a man who was arrogant and unaccountable and using authority to bully people he perceived as not belonging. She had found that. She had also found the offer in the closed office, which was not the behavior of a man who merely bullied, but the behavior of a man who had built a system. Systems had architects. Systems had beneficiaries. Systems had chains of approval that, when followed upstream, led to rooms and desks and signatures larger than the man currently sitting in conference room B. Pruitt had made himself very useful to someone. She needed to know to whom. That was a question for tomorrow. Tonight there was Cassidy and 7 transfer forms and whatever additional documentation he had been carrying on his person for 8 months, and there was the list she needed to build 11 names, 11 outcomes, the evidentiary backbone of a formal proceeding. She went inside. They met at 2100 in the laundry room of the visiting officer's quarters, which was empty at that hour and had no surveillance coverage, a gap in the base security layout that she had identified during her initial facility review. Cassidy arrived 2 minutes after her and sat on the bench along the far wall. He reached inside his jacket and removed a manila envelope, worn at the corners, that had the look of something handled with care over a long period. He set it on the bench between them. 7 forms, he said, each one fully completed, each one denied. His signature on every denial. He paused. I have the dates memorized. February 2020 was the first. March 2022 was the last. Mara opened the envelope. The forms were crisp, preserved with more care than the worn envelope suggested. Each one filled in the same precise handwriting, the careful penmanship of a man who had been trained to write legibly and had never stopped. Each one with a receiving unit, a justification, the standard administrative notation, and on each one in handwriting immediately recognizable to anyone who had reviewed the documents, Pruitt routinely signed a single-line denial. Date, signature, 7 times. She read through all 7 without speaking. When she looked up, Cassidy was watching the dryer running in the corner, its circular window lit and turning the mechanical indifference of a machine doing its single task without regard for what was happening in the room around it. "What are you going to do after this?" Mara asked. He considered the question as if it were practical rather than rhetorical. "I'd like to finish my service," he said, "in a unit where I'm doing something that matters rather than standing next to something that doesn't and keeping quiet about it." He paused. "That's all I want." She put the 7 forms back in the envelope. "I'll make sure that's in the record," she said. He looked at her. She met his gaze. There was nothing more to say about it, and neither of them tried to say anything more. They sat in the laundry room for another minute in the specific silence of 2 people who have each separately, and at considerable cost, chosen the same direction, and who have just in this moment confirmed it to each other. Then Cassidy stood, nodded once, and left. Mara sat with the envelope in her hands. She thought about Dennis Farrow, who had trusted his chain of command and died on a hillside because a decision made by someone above him had gone wrong and had not been examined clearly after the fact. She thought about 11 people whose names she was going to read tonight and compile into a document that would survive a formal proceeding. She thought about Cassidy carrying 7 pieces of paper on his body for 8 months because he no longer trusted any storage he didn't physically control. All of them had done the right thing and been held by a structure that was designed at its current level to redirect that impulse back into silence. She was going to change that. She went to her room, she opened her laptop, and began to build the list. She worked until 01:30. The list was 11 names, each with a line, each line with dates, performance metrics, the formal assessment outcome, and beside each outcome, in a separate column, the reason it did not hold up against the protocol it claimed to be operating under. The documentation gap was precise and specific in every case, not the natural variance of professional judgment, which could produce occasional inconsistencies, but the systematic application of a different set of criteria than the ones the program officially required. 9 of 11 cases, pattern not variance. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the screen. She thought about Pruitt in the closed office making the offer with the practiced ease of a man who had made it before and watched it work. She thought about the thing he had said, the network of people who fill command slots. The casual assumption that the network was available to him. The confidence of a man who had not been questioned in a long time. That confidence had a source. She was going to find it in the morning. She sent the completed document to the NCIS duty agent on the encrypted channel and went to sleep. The administrative annex of Fort Bragg was a low brick building set back from the main compound, connected by a covered walkway that in November collected wind from the west. Conference Room B was the 3rd door on the left inside the main entrance, a room used ordinarily for unit reviews and budget discussions, furnished with a long table, a dozen chairs, and a projection screen on the far wall that was not currently in use. When Mara arrived at 0750, the room already held 4 people. 2 were NCIS investigators she had not met before, a man and a woman in their 40s, with the blend of formal and watchful that characterized federal investigators who work military cases. They had been in the building since before dawn. The 3rd was Rear Admiral Diane Merritt. She was standing at the window with her coffee, looking out at the parking lot with the expression of a woman who has been awake long enough for the morning to have shifted from early to simply here. She turned when Mara entered and looked at her with the measuring assessment she always brought to encounters that mattered. "Weston," she said. "How are you?" "Ready," Mara said. The 4th person was Owen Cassidy. He was sitting at the far end of the table, hands resting on the surface in front of him, no coffee. He looked up when she came in and held her gaze for a moment with the stone-colored steadiness she had first seen in the briefing hall 2 days ago. He looked like a man who had slept badly and did not regret the reason why. The female investigator, who introduced herself as Agent Hartley, ran through the structure of the proceeding. Formal witness hearing under military law. Pruitt had been notified at 700 and had arrived in the building at 7:30 with a JAG legal representative. Slade had been notified separately and was in a waiting room on the other side of the building. "We'll bring Pruitt in at 800, Hartley said. "Lieutenant Weston, you'll present your documentation first." Mara nodded. At 0759, the door opened and Colonel Raymond Pruitt walked in. He wore his service uniform with the same precision as the day before. Every decoration in place. Every crease correct. He had the bearing of a man who had decided in the hours between yesterday afternoon and this morning that the appropriate strategy was to walk into this proceeding with the same ownership with which he walked into every room on this base, to remind every person present through posture and expression and the fact of his rank that he had been here for years, and that permanence was its own form of authority. He sat down. His JAG representative sat beside him. Pruitt looked at Merritt at the NCIS agents at Mara. His gaze passed over Cassidy and stopped for 1 second longer than any of the others before moving on. That second was the only thing in his composure that was not under control. Hartley opened the proceedings. Mara placed the recording device on the table. She stated the date, the time, the location, and the parties involved. She stated that the recording had been made under mission protocol authorization and that its contents constituted evidence of an unauthorized inducement offered to an assessment operative during the conduct of a formal integrity evaluation. She pressed play. Pruitt's voice filled the room with the same measured certainty it had carried in the closed office. The offer, the framing, the network of people who fill command slots, the implied architecture of what would happen if she said yes and what would happen if she said no. When it ended, the room was quiet. Pruitt's JAG representative leaned over and said something in his ear. Pruitt did not respond. He was looking at the recording device on the table with an expression that had over 2 minutes and 40 seconds of audio, shed every layer of administrative performance, and arrived at something older and flatter underneath. Mara opened the second document. 11 officers, she said, between January 2020 and October 2022, discharged for cause, involuntarily transferred or assessed as unqualified through this program. She slid the document toward Hartley. I've cross-referenced their service records with their assessment outcomes and compared the documentation against the stated criteria in the ATLP protocol. The documentation doesn't match what the protocol requires. In 9 of 11 cases, the grounds cited in the assessment records are either insufficient to support the outcome or inconsistent with the performance data collected during the assessment itself. Each name had a line. Each line had dates, metrics, the formal assessment outcome, and the specific documentation gap. 11 lines, 11 people. Hartley reviewed the document carefully. The male investigator was photographing each page. Pruitt's composure had not collapsed. She had not expected it to. He cleared his throat. These are assertions, he said, his voice level, professional, the voice of a man presenting a counter-argument rather than defending himself. Performance assessment involves judgment, professional judgment exercised over the course of a multi-day evaluation. What you're presenting as inconsistency is the natural variance between quantitative metrics and qualitative leadership evaluation. That's a reasonable explanation for 1 or 2 cases, Mara said. She held his gaze. 11 follows a different pattern. Pruitt looked at her. Colonel, Hartley said, do you have anything to add regarding the recording? The JAG officer started to respond. Pruitt held up one finger. The JAG officer stopped. Pruitt was still looking at Mara, and in his face, in the quality of the silence that preceded what he said next, she saw something she had not been looking for. Not recalculation, not the calculation of the closed office. Something deeper. The look of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just in this moment decided to set it down. I followed orders, he said. The words landed differently than anything else spoken in that room. Hartley looked up from her document. The male investigator stopped writing. Merritt at the window turned to face the table fully for the first time. Pruitt looked at the table surface, and the performance that had sustained him across 22 years of military career was simply gone. Not in collapse, not dramatically. It was gone the way light goes when a switch is thrown, complete, immediate, without ceremony. The assessment structure in this program, he said. The criteria, the outcomes, the culture being described here. I didn't build that from nothing. The framework was handed to me before I arrived. He looked up. The operational approval, the budget authorization, the mandate for what this program was supposed to select for, and what it was supposed to filter out, those existed before I took command. I walked into a structure, and I operated within it, and I made it worse in specific ways that I own fully. He paused. But I am telling you that if this investigation stops at my rank, it will stop at the wrong place. The room absorbed this. Check the budget authorization for this program, he said. Fiscal year 2019. Check the program mandate revision approval from 2020. Look at who signed those documents. Look at what authority was required to make those revisions without a formal review board, and then ask yourself who in this building held that authority. He looked at Hartley directly. I made choices I am fully responsible for. I'm not here to transfer that responsibility. I am telling you that the framework I operated within was handed down from a level above mine, and the people who handed it to me had rank that made the instruction clear without ever having to be explicit about it. A pause. "I've been waiting," he said quietly, "for someone to come through that door and ask the question for a long time." The room was completely still. Hartley looked at Merritt. Merritt looked at Mara. Mara looked at Pruitt and understood with the specific clarity of someone who had spent years reading what people mean underneath what they say, that this was not a man offering information to escape a consequence. This was a man who had been living inside a structure he had helped build and had been unable to exit the same way Cassidy had been unable to exit, and who had just been handed the same door. "We'll need everything you have," Hartley said. "I know," Pruitt said. "I've been keeping records." That was when Owen Cassidy stood up. He had not been asked to speak. He was formally awaiting witness, and there was a structure to these proceedings that he was operating outside of. Every person in the room understood that, and not one of them moved to stop him. He reached inside his jacket and removed the manila envelope worn at the corners that he had been carrying for 8 months. He opened it and laid the 7 documents on the table in a line one after the other with the deliberate care of a man who has handled these particular papers many times and who understands finally the exact moment for which they were being kept. Transfer request forms, standard military, each fully completed, each with a date, a receiving unit, the standard administrative notation, and on each one in handwriting immediately recognizable to everyone at that table who had ever seen a document. Pruitt routinely signed a single-line denial. Date, signature, the same hand 7 times. "I submitted these between February 2020 and March 2022, Cassidy said. His voice had the quality of someone reading a prepared statement, not because he had prepared one, but because the precision required all the steadiness he had. "I watched what was happening in this program from the beginning. I knew what it was. I tried to leave and I was prevented from leaving, and I stayed silent because I believed staying silent was the only way to continue functioning in a structure I couldn't exit." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I've known I was wrong about it for a long time." He looked at Mara. "I want these entered into the formal record," he said. Hartley looked at the documents, at Cassidy, at Pruitt. Pruitt was looking at the 7 forms laid out on the table, his handwriting on all of them. His face held the stillness of a man watching a door close on a room he had believed was secure. "They'll be entered," Hartley said. The formal proceeding lasted 4 hours. Slade was brought in separately in the late morning. He sat across from the investigators with the posture of a man who had done the calculation and found that loyalty is a commodity whose value changes depending on the direction the evidence is pointing. He cooperated fully and specifically with the kind of recall that becomes available when the alternative is receiving the undivided weight of what has been documented. He provided names, dates, the specific mechanics of how certain assessments had been altered and how certain complaints had been redirected before they could reach formal filing. At 1340, Hartley came to find Mara in the corridor. Pruitt had been formally suspended from command pending investigation. Slade had been placed under administrative hold. The name Pruitt had provided the signatory on the 2019 budget authorization and the 2020 mandate revision, had been flagged to a higher investigative authority whose scope exceeded NCCYS's immediate jurisdiction. The investigation was not over. It was structurally only beginning. But the part of it that lived in Conference Room B and in the ATLP compound, and in the careers of 11 people who had passed through this program and been sent in the wrong direction, was documented, preserved, and no longer dependent on anyone's willingness to stay silent. Hartley said all of this in the careful language of a federal investigator who has learned to present facts without the architecture of narrative, leaving the person receiving the information to build the meaning themselves. Mara nodded. She walked down the corridor and out through the side door of the administrative annex into the cold afternoon air. There was one more thing. There was always one more thing. She went back inside. The formal statement for the record was standard procedure. The operative conducting the assessment made a closing statement for the official documentation. Merritt was there, Hartley and the male investigator. A junior officer from the base's administrative command present as official witness. Mara stood at the end of the table. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed the G-Shock watch and placed it on the table in front of her. She didn't look at it. She looked at the people in the room. "My spotter wore this watch on the day he died," she said. "He was covering my withdrawal from a position that had gone wrong. He was there because I needed him to be there, and because he had decided a long time before that day that the people above him would make decisions worth following." She paused. He trusted the structure. He trusted that the chain he was part of was built by people who understood what it meant when someone like him put his life at the end of it. The room was completely still. I don't know how many people have walked through doors like the one I walked through yesterday and found that the structure they trusted had been shaped to serve the people at the top of it and no one else. I don't know how many of them tried to report it and found the channel was closed. I don't know how many of them stopped trying. She looked at the watch. I know my spotter never had someone come through that door for him. I know what that cost. She picked up the watch. She put it back on her left wrist and tightened the strap. The small sound of the buckle in the quiet room. The people who stayed silent in this program stayed silent not because they didn't see it and not because they didn't care. They stayed silent because the structure made silence feel like the only viable option. That is not a character failure. She looked at the room. That is what a sufficiently corrupted structure produces in people who are trying to survive inside it. That is worth knowing when this investigation determines what accountability looks like and at which level it stops. She looked at Merritt one last time. Merritt's expression said everything it needed to say and said none of it in a language that would appear in the formal record. That's my statement, Mara said. She picked up her folder from the table. She walked to the door. She walked out. The black SUV was in the parking lot at 1500 engine running. The petty officer assigned to transport duty stood by the rear door and came to attention when she emerged from the side entrance of the annex. Ma'am, ready when you are. She got in. The door closed. The petty officer returned to the driver's seat and pulled out of the lot onto the base road heading north. Through the window, Fort Bragg contracted behind her, the training compound, the administrative annex, the covered walkway, the scrub pine at the tree line. Then the main gate that guards the sign, and then only distance, and the flat Carolina landscape opening on both sides of the highway. Her phone buzzed at the first mile marker. Merritt, encrypted channel. She opened it. The name Pruitt gave us. The budget signatory. I've run the initial check. A pause between messages, the brief interval of a woman choosing her words. You're not going to like it. Then, when you're ready, Mara looked at the screen. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing something specific and pale with the tops of the pine trees along the highway. The light that comes at the end of a day that asks something significant of you, not celebratory, not warm, simply continuing. The kind of light that does not ask whether you are finished. It only asks whether you intend to keep moving. She looked at the cracked face of Dennis Farrow's watch. The diagonal split. The frozen second of a hillside in Kunar province 12 years ago, preserved in glass as the exact moment the world split into before and after. She had carried it through 4 countries and 2 theaters, and one long night in a hospital corridor in Germany, where she had sat outside a surgical unit with the clarity that comes with exhaustion, past a certain depth, thinking about what it means to carry something forward when the person who gave it to you cannot. It meant you did not stop. It meant you kept finding the doors and walking through them. It meant that when something arrived in your hand that you were not going to like, you sent back 2 words and meant them because the alternative was to become one more person who chose the silence that felt safer. She had never been that person. She typed 2 words and sent them. Send it. The phone screen went dark. The highway opened ahead of them, flat and without visible end. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She had approximately 2 hours before the file arrived. She was going to use them. One detail stayed with everyone who had been in conference room B that morning. Not the recording, not the 11 names, not Cassidy standing up without being asked 3 years of paper in his hands, choosing at last to stop carrying it alone. The watch, the way she set it on the table and picked it back up, the way she tightened the strap before she walked out. A junior officer from base administration present as the formal witness wrote in his private notes that evening, not for the record in the notebook he kept for himself, she didn't look like someone who had won. She looked like someone who understood that winning was not the point. The point was the direction. She tightened that strap and walked toward whatever was next, and she didn't look back once. He was right about that. It was always the direction. North on a highway out of Fort Bragg in the back of a black government SUV with a cracked watch on her left wrist and an encrypted file moving toward her phone. Lieutenant Mara Weston, Navy SEAL. No name tag, no announcement, no interest in being thanked for what she had done was already pointed toward it. She always had been.